So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event on the preliminary findings for the Payment Difficulty Framework Review. I'm Simon Corden. I'm the sponsoring commissioner for this work. Look, today is very exciting as this is the first time we've shared these findings with this broader group, and I'm really keen to hear your thoughts. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we're meeting on today. For me, that's the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and the elders of other communities who may be here with us today. I'd like to acknowledge the connection that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture. So on housekeeping, I know by this stage we're all relatively used to these online forums, but just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the Commission's website. If you could stay on mute unless you're speaking to avoid background noise, that would be fantastic. And if you have any questions or comments during the presentations, feel free to add them to the chat. And when we get to the group discussion, if you could use the raise the hand function or continue putting comments in the chat, that'd be great. With 100 people, I think it's really important we can work to that. So fantastic. So to kick us off, I'd like to introduce the people we have with us today. And if you could just give us a wave. First, my fellow Commissioner, Satish Bhojwani. Satish focuses on our compliance and enforcement work, and so I'm sure there'll be some questions and discussion related to that. So it's really great that Satish is able to join us. The Executive Director of Energy, Sarah Shepherd. The Senior Regulatory Manager, Aaron Young, who you will hear from soon, and the Project Review Manager for this review, Lisa Horsburgh. Look, thanks to all of you for attending today. As I said, we've had over 100 registrations, and while there are too many people to name, we have a large number of people from energy retailers and distributors and who've been working through the challenges of implementing the framework and our other related work, such as that relating to outcomes, improving outcomes for those subject to family violence. So thank you for all of the energy retailers and distributor representatives who've been able to join us. We've got a large number of community groups as well, many of whom have been long-term stakeholders relating to our work, but some who are more recently engaged with our work following the challenges of the pandemic and our work on getting to fair. So look, really appreciate so many of you being able to make time to be here today. We've also got representatives from the Energy and Water Ombudsman, the Australian Energy Council, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, the Department of Family, Fairness and Housing, that's a mouthful, the Australian Energy Regulator, whom many of you know is doing related work on trying to improve outcomes for people experiencing vulnerability, and the ACCC. So look, we're extremely pleased that we've had so much interest in the review and the shared commitment to improving outcomes for energy consumers. So thank you all for making time to be here with us today. So welcome everyone. As I mentioned before, this is the first time we'll be sharing the findings, the preliminary findings of our review with this group, and we're very keen to hear your feedback on these findings. So I'm going to hand over to Aaron and Lisa now, who will walk you through them. These are the summary findings, and there'll be a more detailed report released in about a month. So thank you, Aaron and Lisa.
Thanks, Simon, and good to see everyone here today. Hopefully you've all received the slides beforehand as part of your registration, but if you haven't, please let us know and we can get that to you. But we thought it'd be useful to help the discussion today, having something tangible that you can work with and get a sense of where we're going with it. My hope is that this will really just give a clear idea of where we're heading and answer some of the questions that we've already received today as well. I do want to note these are currently preliminary views, and Simon is obviously here as a commissioner to help facilitate the discussion, so commissioners have seen this. As we work through the slides, you might notice some slight changes, mainly to phrasing. Some of you have already reached out to us and rightly pointed out that without some further context or information, some of these statements might leave the wrong first impression. That's not our intent. So hopefully our clarifications and explanations today will help today's discussion. We've got roughly 15 minutes to go through this, so I'll pass to Lisa first, just to talk through processes that we're currently doing, but also some of the successes we've seen to date as well.
Thanks, Aaron. And we've got Alex on the slides with us today. So thanks, Alex. We'll get going on the next slide, please. So before we get into the findings themselves, I just wanted to take a moment to remind you of the process we've undertaken to get to this point and to indicate where we're headed once we publish our findings report. Since the launch of the review in September last year, we've undertaken a program of insights, information, data, and engagement analysis. And we've been pulling these analyses together. And this analysis will take in the form of the findings report. Once released, we will begin the next phase of the review. In this phase, we want to work with you to work through what specifically are the actions we can take next to address and find solutions for the priority areas we identify in our findings report. Next slide, thanks. Our first finding is that since the introduction of the framework in 2019, more energy customers are receiving assistance, and the assistance they're receiving appears to be more appropriate than what they were receiving before 2019. As you can see from this chart, the numbers of customers receiving assistance has increased. We only have combined figures for before 2019 for electricity and gas. But you can see that after 2019, the numbers we have are for each type of energy. Next slide, please, Alex. In terms of appropriateness of assistance, we've heard that since its introduction, the framework has offered clearer structured plans, flexibility for customers, less pressure on customers to agree to unaffordable payment plans, greater customer awareness of their entitlements under the framework, and greater awareness within retailers about the circumstances of customers experiencing vulnerability. Since the high levels of disconnections experienced by customers in 2013-14, disconnections decreased significantly once the framework commenced in 2019. This was particularly of note in 2019, which was not affected by the change in disconnection practices during the coronavirus pandemic in 2020 and 2021. So the next finding we have is that the framework appears to be supporting customers who can pay for their ongoing use. For those customers who are accessing tailored assistance and can pay for their ongoing energy use, the framework does appear to be supporting them. For these customers, their debts with their retailers have remained relatively stable since the introduction of the framework, as you can see in the top chart. However, this has not been the case for customers who cannot pay for their ongoing energy use, as you can see reflected in the bottom chart. For these customers, their average debt levels have increased since 2019. Thanks, Alex. So to sum up, with these first three findings, we've identified these as successes for the way the framework has been implemented. In terms of that third one, particularly of note for the customers who can pay for their ongoing use. And now I will hand over to Aaron to take you through the rest of the findings.
Thanks, Lisa, for those insights and what's been working from the framework and its implementation by retailers. But I'm now going to shift to discuss areas where we think improvements can be made. And when I say improvement, this can be really supported by all of us here today in different ways. And that's what the next step of after our findings report is, and that's to work with you on that. But beforehand, I just want to talk about and highlight areas where we think we can improve. And I just want to start by talking about how consumers might see the framework and some of the issues they may face. And as you look at on this slide, on the top charts, this is analysis we've actually done on actual customer bills in Victoria that we've collected. So the amount that people are actually paying for. And what's evident here is that customers who receive assistance use considerably more electricity than those who are not. And that might be obvious to many of you, but the data really bears that out. Another interesting thing is that on average, what we're seeing is that customers receiving assistance appear to be paying lower energy rates. That's a welcome sign. Although we recognize these are average rates, and so some customers do pay higher. When you look at this as well, the bottom chart actually shows how many customers are offered practical assistance measures under the framework, and that's help and advice to lower usage and also energy costs. And so when you put that together, we're seeing potential opportunity to improve maybe the effectiveness of practical assistance, because the flow-on effects can be very positive for the customer and retailer. It can lead to the prevention of build-up of arrears and can actually improve trust and interaction with retailers as well. And moving to the next slide, in terms of customer context, we also thought about awareness and other underlying issues that customers may face. And what you see here is comes from some consumer research we did last year. It shows that 43% of the surveyed customers in Victoria were aware of payment difficulty entitlements. But that also means that maybe more than half of Victorian customers might not be aware that they could simply call up their retailer to get some help. And what we want to understand is whether those in need of help are aware of that help. We also recognise the complexities of what customers face, and this can make it even harder for customers to make that first contact with the retailer or even engage in discussion. From a lot of the work that we've done in the last year, we recognise that customers might have feelings of shame, high mental load, makes these processes really difficult. The one example here that we've identified is where CAL households, for many reasons, are likely to be less aware of support out there, and indeed being able to interact and get that support that they need. We also recognise the underlying financial position of some customers, and that makes it really difficult for a customer. In slide 6 previously, you would see that the arrears, and Lisa mentioned it, the arrears for customers who cannot pay for ongoing use is increasing. And there might be a few factors that lead to that, but we recognise that these complex financial issues that customers face can make it even difficult for them to interact with tailored assistance from the very start. When you put it all together, it highlights another area that we can focus on, which is about empathy for customers, because what we've found is that given the complexity and issues that customers face, empathy can go a long way to help build that trust and engagement to receive assistance as well. On the next slide, this slide then now talks about some of the variation we've seen across retailers over a number of indicators. And the example on this slide is about the arrears of customers when they commence their tailored assistance. You can see on this graph that it ranges from $195 to $1,500. And this is for customers who can pay for their ongoing usage and receiving assistance. And that's across retailers on an average level. But it does show that some customers are starting with very low arrears, which is a positive sign. And it shows that some customers are getting help very early. But the main thing to note here is that it varies, and we see similar results on how quickly customers enter into assistance. There are many reasons for that, and we want to unpack that with retailers, and we've been doing that with some as well. But some of these factors we've found is it could be about customers on quarterly billing cycles rather than short billing cycles, or it could be about how preemptive a retailer might be. For example, we know some retailers have systems that try and identify the debt really early, make first contact, but sometimes it might just be that the customer struggles to make that first contact to help. Outside of this, we also see variability in a few other areas. One, we see difference in the proportion of customers who successfully complete their assistance without any arrears. And on the flip side, those who exit unsuccessfully. There's many reasons for that. And it comes to perhaps the retailer's discretion on things like debt waivers, giving them time for payment, or discussing new payment terms with the customer. And then the second is about how effective the lodgement of ERG applications are. So the percentage of forms being requested that end up being submitted. But all this shows that there's opportunity, opportunity to improve in certain aspects that we can discuss on the last slide, which will be a big topic for today. And we're also aware that some of these points about early intervention and understanding the consumer context is very much part of AER's work on consumer vulnerability right now, and they're looking into those areas too, which we're very aware of. Now, the next slide, I mentioned ERG or utility relief grants before. This top chart makes it clear that there has been an increase in customers receiving ERGs, which is a good sign. And other data that we haven't shown here is we're seeing an improvement from retailers in supporting customers apply for ERGs. And that seems to have occurred in late 2020, which is in line with the improvements to the system, but as well as new rules that we introduced in October that year. So a positive sign. That being said, that last chart, it's interesting that there is an apparent low proportion of customers receiving assistance, but not on concessions. And you can see that on the bottom chart here. And without taking up too much time, when you put all of that together, this last slide presents all our findings in terms of the current areas or possible areas for improvement that you can look at. And hopefully when you read these dot points, you can see how that links to what I just presented earlier. I won't summarize it because you probably had a good read of this, and this is the place where we're going to take a lot of our discussion at this point. But before we go there, I might just pause to see if there's any questions before we move into a discussion. There might be lots of questions along the way. So with that, we'd love to hear from you now. So I'll pass it on to Simon. So pass back to pass back to Simon for the facilitated discussion.
So thanks, Aaron. In that slide that outlines the possible areas for improvement, you may have some questions about what do we mean by some of them, and we're keen to hear that if you think they need to be clarified. But we're also keen to hear from you if you think there's anything that's missing there. If there are any particular areas where we might want to focus in the second phase of this review that isn't captured there. So I'm keen to hear from those of you around the virtual table of where you think there might be gaps. So does anyone want to kick us off with any questions about those particular initiatives? Con from AGL. Good to hear from you, Con.
Hello, Simon. How are you? And hello to everybody from the EC and everybody else on the call. My apologies. I thought nobody else was going to jump in, so I jumped in to start the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Con.
What I'd be interested in is in some of the slides you presented is if you've done a bit of a deeper drill into some of the outcomes. So I know that in one of the slides you presented the amount of customers receiving tailored assistance versus the amount of customers who are on hardship pre the PDF program.
Yep.
Probably two comments I'd make on that. One is I'm not sure that's a fair comparison or a like-for-like comparison, because if you compare the amount, like to me, tailored assistance 1 is the old instalments plan obligation, and tailored assistance 2 probably aligns with people in hardship programs. So if you compare the amount of people on instalment plans, both in hardship and outside of hardship pre-PDF versus tailored assistance in the current framework, I went and had a look at the data from the 2017-18 market performance report. There was probably more people receiving assistance in total in terms of a payment plan, either in the hardship program or outside of hardship program. So that doesn't mean that being on a payment plan, you're getting better assistance, but I'm just saying a like-for-like comparison would show there's probably less people payment plans under PDF than pre-PDF. And that leads to my second point, and that's when you start to drill into going onto a payment plan is the first step of helping customers, but not necessarily the end of it. And I was interested to see if you've done any analysis in terms of how people, once they go onto a payment plan, TA1 or TA2, how they are resolved at the end of the payment plan. And what I mean by resolve is do they complete the payment plan in a much better financial position? Do they not complete the plan? Or is there some other outcome for those customers? And I did notice in your latest market performance report you did in 2021, which came out recently, you did have a diagram in there, which you haven't used today, which said that only about 30% of customers actually complete a tailored assistance plan successfully. And I'm assuming that's TA1 and TA2.
Yeah.
And then 70% of customers are exiting tailored assistance for non-compliance with a debt or a switch. To me, 1 in 3 success, a 30% success rate is not a great outcome. 70% of customers are still left in a pretty poor outcome if they get into the point of tailored assistance and they've got more debt, or they're not finalising the plan, or they're switching. And I think they're the type of analysis I think we need to really drill down to and understand that are tailored assistance 1 and 2 really allowing the customers to get into a position where they're going to be better off at the end of the process when they go onto these payment plans? Because if we're saying we've got more people on tailored assistance, which I don't think is quite true, but they're getting to the end of that payment plan and they're actually not in a better position, and 70% aren't in a better position, there's something that's fundamentally wrong. And I'm not saying it's PDF, but there's something else going on that's impacting these customers, and we really need to drill down and figure out what is the cause of those 70% of customers and trying to address some of those issues. Have you done that sort of type of analysis?
I'll hand over to Aaron in a sec, but one thing I'd observe is we've been looking at that sort of analysis, but because the pandemic confounds a lot of the analysis, and because this is about implementation, not about changing the basic rules, what we've been looking at is the difference across retailers, and different retailers have quite different. So that average, you're right, 30%, and I agree with you, that's not where we want to be. That's not the end outcome we want to get to, but we are intrigued that there is differences, quite substantial differences across retailers, even amongst looking at this big, medium, and then the small. But Aaron, you might be able to address Con's question a bit more fully.
Look, I was going to say very similar sentiments, Simon. So yeah, we have, and we didn't show that in this set of slides, Con, but you are right about those figures, particularly on exits. On slide 10, where we talked about the variability, to Simon's point, we see that same variability about exits for success, goals for non-compliance per se. So we are trying to dig a little deeper on that. The cause and effect question, I think, is an important one to unpack as well. So I recognise that.
And we had a bit of a discussion with AER, the meeting of AER board and the ESC commission a week or so ago. That was one of the issues that you raised. The challenge we face in comparing the national data with the state-based data is the experience of the pandemic has been quite different in Victoria, obviously, than the average for the other states. But absolutely important point, and 30%, yep, that's not where we want to be ultimately. So great question. Is there any other clarification or observation anyone would like to make? Particularly keen if you think we've missed something. Ben from AEC.
Hi, Simon. Look, I don't think it's a missing thing. I just think it's a challenging thing. The third dot point in your possible priority areas talks about assistance offered by the framework may not best support some customers who cannot pay for their ongoing usage. And I think that's ultimately the biggest challenge with any framework. It's similar things that we see in the AER's hardship framework, where customers can't afford it. There is a kind of an impasse between how retailers and customers can interact. I guess one challenge with the framework that I've observed is it was kind of intended to allow customers a period of time to pay. And that was the intent of tailored assistance 2. It gave customers 6 months where they could pay effectively what they could afford based on what they identified. And one thing I wondered if you'd looked into or considered was whether that approach was either exacerbating poor outcomes for customers and effectively putting them in a position that at the end of that 6-month period, they were worse off, or whether there was a way that you could have measured using the data that you had to identify whether that 6-month period was enabling customers to get themselves as best sorted as they could. And then there was a sort of small cohort of customers who were worse off. I guess I don't think there's an answer for it. It's really the biggest challenge that we have here, that customers just can't afford, or some customers just can't afford their energy use under any framework. But I just want to make sure that the TA2 doesn't exacerbate it for customers, and whether there's any way to identify the percentage of customers who come off TA2 and move on to TA1, or kind of stay on TA2 forever.
All good points, Ben. I think I'd say about the third dot point assistance offered by the framework may not best support customers who cannot pay for the ongoing usage. One of the, absolutely, that's a real challenge. One of the important changes I think that was made, as Aaron mentioned, was changes to the utility grants, relief grants, which are a Victorian specific amount, and that's about $1,300, which gets paid directly to the retailer, which reduces the net debt. So while that, when these people come on to assistance, if they've got very large debts, 1,300 is maybe just a chip at it, but it can be quite substantial. And again, we made the change to require the retailers, as you know, to provide more assistance to completing those government forms, because they're not always the easiest to complete, and a lot of people who are experiencing vulnerability are less able to complete that sort of paperwork that they need to. And Aaron, you might be able to speak about, again, we've found quite big differences between how retailers have responded to that. So we built on the experience of the water sector, which with some water businesses are really good at helping consumers navigate their way through that. And what we're finding is some retailers, energy retailers, are already very good, and some have got a way to go, which I think is perhaps a question for the next phase. But Aaron, did you want to add anything to that?
Not on the ergs, because I think you covered a lot of that, Simon, the variation there. But on the arrears, I think that's a good point, Ben. So we take that one back. But I think one thing that is clear in some of the data is on an average level, for those who can pay ongoing use, you're seeing the stability across it, and this bears out in commencement of arrears. But it is true that for those who cannot pay, that is an increasing trend. So I think that speaks to some of your points, Ben, as well.
Right. Is there anyone else who has any questions about the possible areas for improvement? I think David had a response in the chat. Is that right? I want to keep track of the chat as well. So kind of agreeing with David. David Bryant, measures to durably lower energy costs like energy efficiency upgrades would assist in the situation where people can't afford to pay. I think that's absolutely one of the challenges, that many of these challenges are broader than what can be achieved just within the energy sector. I mean, it gets to the quality of rental and public housing, the energy efficiency of that. It gets to the access to solar and other new technologies, which I don't know if Gavin's on the call. I know Gavin's very keen to focus on that issue. So absolutely, there's limitations on what can be achieved. Sorry, Jared, you wanted to add something to that?
Thanks, Simon. Hello, everyone. It's Jared Lenny from the Victorian Council of Social Service. I suppose the follow-on question from that is if you'd had any data on those who aren't in the framework but are in arrears, because they're always concerned about people who are not getting support but need the advice or the clear guidance to come into the framework. And I suppose my second one, while I'm quick, Simon, is the question is always, how do large debts build up given the early intervention measures? And I know that we've touched on that. I mentioned we'll go a bit further on comparative best practice.
Aaron, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so we did look at the arrears levels, and I don't have the numbers with me, but there is a recognition that there are a number of customers who have maybe higher arrears, above $300 or so, that might not be captured, or maybe going in and out of assistance as well. So we speak to that, but we haven't drawn huge attention to it just for this point, but it's a good point, Jared. I forgot what your last one was though.
It was, or who's not being picked up in the framework, given that there's people who are in arrears but are not being captured, perhaps.
Yeah. So I think to that point, so we're aware of those numbers. I think a lot of it as well is about that early intervention and the recognition of a lot of the notices that are provided to customers when they miss bills and what spurs that on. So that's definitely a focus area as well. I think in just linking back to some of the dot points here of how we want to try and think about areas for improvement, Jared, I think to that point, dot point 4 about the timing of communication and the appropriateness, what that's sort of trying to say is there ways to actually improve that hook so that customers can get that support earlier? And then to David's point about measures to lower energy use, that dot point on the top right, that's trying to cover that area as well, where it's saying those things are very useful. We think those are areas that can best support customers. So trying to cover that through.
I'll just add two other comments. One is, I think, a significant number of people who are disconnected in hardship haven't gone on any sort of payment plans. They haven't been able to effectively engage with their retailer before it gets to the point of disconnection. That's clearly a major concern for, I mean, I'm speaking to retailers, that's a major concern of retailers. They want to engage with people early. But one of the dot points with the second one we've got is about consumers experiencing vulnerability, disproportionately experience barriers to receiving assistance. What we're hearing, and I suppose this one is more anecdotal, is that it's sometimes difficult for people who are third parties who are helping, who are seeking to help their clients. They can find it difficult to engage effectively with the retailer on behalf of their clients, because we know many of the clients of the community sector, find it very difficult to engage with people on call centres. They might have English language difficulties, etc. I know, Sandy, you're with us, Sandy Ross from Financial Counselling. I know that's something you've raised with us before. How do you make it easier for people like your organiser, people like your members, to be able to engage with the hardship teams in the retailers? So I see Stephen White, you've got your hand up. Did you want to add anything or ask a question?
I think you actually, thanks Simon, I think you actually touched on the point I was just about to ask. I was going to seek, just ask around the clarification on the points for improvement around if there was an examination of disengagement and how to overcome those. Noting from a retailer point of view, that is probably one of our biggest challenges, is ensuring customers do engage. Realistically, that's our main priority and probably our main difficulty to overcome. And so I was just more curious to see if there was any findings out of that around customers that were disengaged and weren't responding to notices and things, and improvements on that.
Look, on that, one of the things we're keen to work with the sector in the second phase of this work, because again, it's something we see quite differences in the data, even amongst the large retailers. The arrears that people commence tailored assistance varies quite significantly, and try and understand why have some retailers been able to, with their customer base, make that contact more effectively earlier, and why others are finding it more difficult. And we're trying to understand what the factors might be behind that. So that's the sort of thing we want to dig into in the second phase of this report.
Is that actually going to examine the actual mandated communications and things under the code, and the actual process for communicating?
Look, I think we said at the start of this, we're not proposing to revisit the code.
No, sorry. I'm just wondering if there is.
Yeah. But if people can find a way that the code could be made, if there are barriers to effective implementation, if retailers are finding that the current code restricts people from making the most effective ways to engage their consumers, it's something we'd be keen to hear about. But we're certainly at the start of this process. It's an implementation review. It's not opening up the whole box, which I know many of you are keen to not move to that stage. Emma, can I go to you now? Good to see you again.
Sure, good to see you, Simon, and thank you for the really interesting review. Just 2 points from me. One is that through our financial counsellors, we still see people coming in on some very high rates. And when we talk to various industry members about this, about proactively shifting people onto better rates, even before they end up in the PDF program, there are either real or perceived barriers to doing that proactive shifting. So perhaps there's a role for the ESC in addressing those issues. And the other is, I think we completely acknowledge that this is a multifaceted issue. It's about retailer practices. It's about the quality of the housing stock. It's about access to solar, and it's absolutely about shocking social security systems in this country. I think what we would be really welcome if there is a bit more of a cross-sector push for lifting the rate of job seeker. We saw during COVID, and I would love to hear from retailers like what they saw at that end when job seeker was doubled, what effect that had on people, and if it can be more of a cross-sector push to raise those rates and address these issues, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, we did have comments at the start to keep the scope of this, the PDF review, to the implementation. So I don't think a review of the social services system will be quite in scope, but yeah, absolutely, it's all interconnected. And I think we've found in the retailer forums, we've had those periods where those large substantial increases in social security payments was really helpful for people there, sort of people who'd been experiencing vulnerability for a long time. But I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. But yeah, we've had various community forums, people suggest we should fix up the NBN and we should fix up a whole range of things. So the social security system might be a challenge, but absolutely it's interconnected. Carl, did you want to add anything? I see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Just picking up on the bullet point around lack of empathy at retailers, I think there's a broader point here about training to ensure consistency. We're doing a lot of work specifically helping people with their energy bills in the public housing estates around Melbourne. And we see inconsistency between retailers, but also within retailers. And this impacts on consumer awareness of the framework, because if we tell someone what they can expect with the support they can get from their retailer under PDF, if their first interaction is a negative one because the person on the other end of the line doesn't know the rules and the support that's available, then you've potentially lost that household's engagement for several years. So we'd really like to see some training to make sure that the support that's offered is consistent. Also, the bullet point about whether concessions and ERGs can be more effectively handed out, I guess. Is there any reason why it can't be a part of tailored assistance part 1? It doesn't make a lot of sense that we're only uniformly offering ERGs and concessions at the point where people are really in strife, they can't afford their ongoing usage and they have a debt. We are finding a lot of people who have concession cards who are missing out on getting their concessions. We're seeing a lot of people who have debts who haven't been told about the best offer, and they seem like two very effective ways that we can make sure the assistance that is available is going to the right place.
Look, you raise really interesting points. I think Aaron pointed out earlier, across the people on experiencing hardship or on payment plans, the average payment price is about the same as the average for the rest of the community, but there is quite a bit of variability, and there are some consumers on hardship plans who appear to be paying substantially higher prices than others. I think that's a really important issue we can look at in the second phase. I mean, it's Aaron, you wanted to add something about the question about empathy, which is a really challenging issue, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think most of you are aware that we have collected call recordings from a sample of customers across the sector, trying to understand what are those interactions like from a perspective of a consumer. And I think, yeah, I think those are good points, Carl. And also just to reiterate that there are also positive examples of empathy where it actually shows that it works on the positive side. So almost sort of the case that that little touch in a conversation can actually improve the outcome. That could be better for both customers and retailers as well. But I completely take those points too.
And we'll be releasing the call recording study, which has been done by an independent firm that's reviewed the call recordings and rated them. We'll be releasing that shortly at the time of the preliminary findings report. But it does raise interesting. One of the observations I've heard recently from someone who used to work in an energy retailer was that they felt that there'd been an improvement in that, while it's still obviously way to go, since the family violence provisions were put in place, that a lot of the education and focus on family violence had led to an improvement in people being more empathetic on the other end of the phone. But we also hear there's a way to go in improving, in addressing that. Are there any other questions? Let me see. Is the terms of reference to the independent consultants available? So we've got a consultancy brief. They're going to produce a report. I haven't seen the draft report at this stage, so I hope that'll be clear about what the scope of the piece of work is. And also, when we spoke to the consultants, one of the things that we need to be clear in the report is about how random, that we didn't just get call recordings that retailers offered us up, the ones where they'd had good conversations, that there was a sort of a randomised sampling process. Emma, did you have something you want to add?
No, I've just been lax in putting my hand down. Thanks, Simon.
Fantastic. Right. So, Chiara, did you want to speak to that?
And I'm exceptionally clear, Simon, that this is not the scope of this meeting today, but I think interestingly, those like myself who are complete data nerds really like to understand. I mean, there's a lot of evidence coming out. I think Con mentioned, a couple of others have mentioned the fact that there's a genuine capacity to pay issue here. Emma clearly highlighted that, but I think the evidence of your review of this payment typical framework, which essentially exists to tackle some of those issues for those people who cannot afford to pay, is still showing that even though there's a regulatory framework designed around supporting those humans, and there's some glitches in that system, as there always are, but I think it's still sort of really highlighting the fact that those with real capacity to pay issues, even with those, all best efforts, are still not being able to afford to pay. And so therefore, how can we possibly use some of the data that's coming out of this review to I guess to kind of, inform the fact that we probably need a whole of systems approach to tackle that particular issue. So this is one piece of the puzzle, but I think the data that you have and the insights that you have could actually really support some other possible changes that I think, Jared and Emma, and I know Sandy, because I can see his face, would all very much, see as an issue.
Look, absolutely. I think two responses to that. Firstly, we've got the two policy departments that have got a broader scope than we do as a regulator are participating in a lot of the consultation, and we'll have obviously be able to see our report. And they're the ones that have the levers in many ways. The Department of Family Fairness and Housing and the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning are here. We don't have anyone from the Commonwealth Department of Social, whatever that Centrelink department, the relevant
DSS, yep.
DSS, but the relevant state agencies are with us because they're keen and been keen through this process to partner. This is a whole of system sort of challenge, but the extent of the national challenges, I think we'll have to leave that to another thing. But the information will be published, and you'll be able to use it in the other people on this call in any advocacy work you've got related to that. The AR is also, we've been working closely with the AR, both participating in their forums and they're in ours, and they're taking, some people may have been at the Game Changer exercise they ran a couple of week or so ago, and they're looking at also those sort of broader issues. I'll just take Travis, you've got one question, and then we'll move to the next phase. So Travis.
Thanks, Simon. Considering this is focused on implementation of the PDF and comparing, I suppose, the retailers that are providing the PDF at a proper standard and those retailers are not up that level yet, is it worth just considering the ESC having discussions with the retailers that aren't doing it as expected? If we're looking at how the good retailers have done, and we're saying that's correct, and we're only looking at implementation, shouldn't this review just be maybe considering discussions with the retailers that haven't done it correctly and policing them better?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be engaging with the retailers. We've got a range of metrics which show variation across retailers, and we plan to engage with individual retailers to help them first understand that what appears to us to be a higher or lower outcome than others is actually based there, because there sometimes can be issues with some of the data in terms of people having debt write-offs and different programs. Not every retailer, the data can actually tell you the exact story, but we'll definitely be engaging with each of the retailers so that they can understand where they sit in the data and where they can improve it. And I think in some of these areas, I know the retailers on the call, they don't want people to have high arrears, right? They want people to be able to pay their bills. The time and effort that they spend supporting people can be quite substantial, as we've found in the call recording study, the number of calls that individual customers can have. So we would definitely want to work with the retailers and with the community sector to try and address these implementation gaps. So yeah, absolutely agree with you, Travis.
Yeah, I suppose just to add to that then, if it's not just a matter that can be resolved with discussions with the retailers that aren't performing, and there are changes that need to be made to the PDF that you believe, and that would impact also the retailers that are providing it as expected, then wouldn't that suggest that we can look into other elements of the PDF? You know, it's not just limited to implementation. And if it's looking at other, you know, broadening the scope, so we potentially can look at other things that could improve it.
Look, absolutely, that's something for a later day. I think at the moment, what our data is suggesting is there's substantial scope to get better outcomes through better implementation. The scope of this review, because it's quite early in the period that the PDF, the payment difficulties framework, has been in place, that we are not opening it up for a broader substantial changes to the actual requirements. We're really focusing on how do we, and it's not just about the retailers, right? I mean, the Commission has a responsibility in terms of helping the community understand what their obligations are. As I think a number of people have pointed out, a significant number of people who could get support don't make contact with their retailers. And that may be something that we in the community sector can work together to raise awareness of their entitlements. So absolutely, but the focus at this point is on making sure that the PDF is implemented as well as it possibly can be.
Thanks.
Take your point on board, Travis, so thank you for that. We've got I think people are generally comfortable, from what I can understand, with the list of possible areas for improvement, and I haven't had too many questions about the clarification of what each one means. What we recognise is in the next phase, working with retailers in the community sector, we're not going to be able to do all this, and we've got to prioritise and focus on where we think as a group the biggest bang for the buck. And so what we'd like to do now is to get your feedback on where we might prioritise our work and analysis working with the retailers and community sector in the next phase. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a polling exercise, and we're going to use a poll to capture your views. So you can see what's popped up on your screen is a list of the various initiatives, and what we're keen to get is what you think of might be the top 5 priority areas for us to work with retailers and the community sector in the second phase of this review. Now, we'll come back to this after the preliminary findings report is finalised, but we're really keen to, because you're the experts, both the community sector and the retailers, in terms of where you think it will have the biggest impact on customers. So of the items here, if you could tick the 5 that you think are the most highest priority. Is there any questions about that? So it should have popped up on your screen. I think it's, Lisa, it automatically pops up. It's only popped up on mine. Aaron, just checking if you can see it.
I can see it. And we're just looking for the top 5 that you think. So please choose 5.
So there's 89 participants. I'm looking for 89 respondents. You can only vote once, I believe, Lisa. It's not vote early.
Once, but for 5. For 5 of the options.
So Alex is going to let me know how many votes we've got, how many people have filled in the polls, so I know when to present them and we can open discussion. We've got 47 voted so far, so I'm looking for the other 41 of you. I don't want to see any donkey votes.
I was going to say, it feels like a US election.
It's better run than the US election. We didn't get the polling system from Venezuela. So I think we've got about 60 odd. Just give it another minute or two. I mean, it is a challenge to work out where you get the biggest bang for our buck. Okay, we're nearly there. So if you're still pondering, if you can. So what we're going to do after we've see the results of that, what we're intrigued to understand is ones which potentially are, okay, we've got 69 people out of the 86 people voted. So it's not quite what we get in an Australian election, but that's pretty good. It's not compulsory voting, unfortunately, for this exercise. Okay. Alex, do you think you're ending the poll now? We've got 70 people voted to given their views. So Alex is going to put that poll up on the screen, and you'll see, so energy consumers' awareness and knowledge of their entitlements. Can they be ranked, or do we, Alex, or do we just have to, we go down the list? Okay, so all right, so top ones, I have to eyeball it, is many customers have high arrears despite standard assistance. Aiming at avoiding getting them into arrears. So that's a pretty high one. So that's 64% of you thought that was high. Assistance by the framework may not best support some customers who cannot pay for their ongoing usage. And that's about 65% of you rated that in the top 5. I think Aaron's going to quickly put in the chat what the top 5 are, because I don't think we can't sort them, can we? So what I'd like to do next is some of them which came up as our top sort of 11 or so, top 11 issues ranked relatively low. And I'm interested in people who thought that it should be higher, but others haven't shared that view, to sort of just give us an explanation of why they thought that one should be higher up the list. Is anyone able to speak to the timing, appropriateness and timing of retail communication? What's underlying their thinking as to why that should be in the sort of top 5? Because 23% of you did indicate that should be in the top 5. So Sandy, you wanted to speak to that?
Yeah, I had that in my list, and the reason I did have that in my list was that was one of a couple of different things which referred back to the issues around consistency.
Right.
And from our perspective, there's a significant problem with the consistency in response to customers and to their advocates on the part of energy retailers, and consistency within retailers as well as between and across retailers. And it points in our suspicion to just ongoing problems with adequacy of the consumer support and response systems that retailers have. I mean, serious investment in those areas will see well-established and well-trained cohorts of staff with minimal consistency response problems. And it's an ongoing, long-standing problem. And even when it seems to be addressed periodically, quality falls off, changes happen, and investment diminishes. So it's a recurring kind of problem as well. So I nominated that issue amongst others because it spoke to me about that fundamental issue around consistency.
Interesting. Jared, you had your hand up about that one as well?
Thanks, Simon. Jared speaking. It's more of a nuance, I think, in terms of there's a variation between practice, but the issue is the effectiveness of the practice. So I agree with Sandy's point that consistency helps give confidence that practice is being well done. But that one may not have got as high as many ticks as you might have expected, because the question in the survey, and I know the survey is just intended to get us thinking and talking, focuses on the variation. Yes, more consistency, even better, more effectiveness.
Fantastic. Did anyone want to talk about the retailer's use of discretion in delivering payment plans, the variation we see in that? Just having trouble seeing. Does anyone from one of the retailers want to talk to the challenges of that, and whether or not that should be a higher thing? I think, Con, you mentioned about the 30% successful completion.
What's your question? Sorry, Simon.
Oh, we've got retailers' use of discretion in delivering payment plan varies. 27% of people thought that was in the top 5, but the others didn't. Did you have any views on the importance of that particular initiative? Because you talked about payment plans previously.
Well, I can. It's quite a complex issue. I think discretion is important.
Yep.
But I think, and I'll go back to the point Kira made before, when one of the big changes we made from pre-PDF to PDF is remove this capacity to pay assessment, because of some views that capacity to pay assessment wasn't properly utilised by retailers by pushing customers and taking customers' agency away. I actually think we've overcorrected now, and there's a fair bit. The one tick I give the PDF is given a fair bit of agency to customers, but I think that agency potentially comes at a cost sometimes for customers, because customers sometimes need, and it's in any services like banks will always tell customers when they're overcommitting in terms of home loans they're taking out. Now, I'm not saying energy usage is the same as a home loan or any other loan,
right? But
I think we need a better balance between giving a customer agency, but also being able to have a hard conversation with the customer around what that agency may mean for them from the longer term. And you've already picked up the fact that TA2 does lead to worse debt outcomes for customers. And I've got a real concern that this growing debt is going to create a significant problem that's just bubbling under the surface and not being addressed. I think discretion is good, but that discretion needs to come with that ability to have a proper conversation with the customer around their capacity to pay, and giving them some agency, but also them understanding what that means from any decisions they make about the type of payment plans they commit to. So I'm not sure if that's a long-winded answer, but it's not just as complex as having discretion. Discretion comes with other things that we don't have in the framework at the moment that would lead to, I think, better outcomes for customers.
Okay, no, I mean, it is a challenge. I mean, I think we're seeing these rising arrears for people who can't pay their ongoing usage, and the impact that must have on consumers in terms of that sitting at the sort of monkey on their shoulder in terms of concerns about that.
And the only thing I'd add to that, Simon, is if they've got a debt in energy, they've got a debt probably with other service providers as well. So it's not just the social impact that their energy is causing. It's probably a life stress on them. And yeah, you've mentioned quite a few times that this review is not about anything but looking at how to better implement the PDF. But I think, as others have echoed, there's a real opportunity for this review to call out some of these broader issues that are happening and the impacts they're having on customers. Because if somebody doesn't have a voice for them through this review, I feel like they're just going to be left further behind, and debt will continue to grow. And the problem with debt is, and you know, I'm lucky enough not to always be in debt, but in times I do go into debt, I know what I do. I put my head in the sand and try and avoid the debt. And the more people are building up the debt, whether it's just in energy or other life expenses, the harder it is to engage with those consumers. It doesn't matter. You could have the world's best communication, the gold-plated communication system, but when you impose such a significant amount of debt on customers, they will go in hiding. That's just human nature. It's human reaction that you do it. I know I do it myself for small amounts of debt. So I think there's a real opportunity for the Commission to actually start to call this stuff out in this review and actually have a voice for these customers.
Okay, no, good points. Looking at the ones that were, like the one that came number 6 in the list of sort of priorities was lowering energy costs and usage are also key to supporting consumers. About half of you thought that was in the top 5, but half of you didn't. I'm interested in anyone who thought that one is a higher priority and why. I suppose one of the things, we're looking at ones which will have an impact on consumers, but also ones where we, working with you as partners, can influence. So I'd be interested to see if anyone's advocating that to be higher up the priority list. Has anyone got any views on that one?
I would personally just say with that one, I imagine many of my colleagues in the community sector would be also advocating for lower energy costs. But to be honest, it was more, I found that was more addressed in the first two, which was that assistance being offered by the framework isn't supporting the people's capacity to pay, and also that those who have higher arrears are avoiding, that there's some issues with those with higher arrears. So I connected myself, I was saying, well, yes, that is the case, lower energy costs. And I think, again, from my perspective, that should be a supply chain issue. But I felt like that was sort of addressed in the higher priority for me, which was that the assistance didn't support those who had capacity to pay, and that we were continuing to see higher arrears. I don't know if any of my colleagues had a similar view, but I picked those two above that one because I felt it was wrapped into those two.
Okay. Anyone else want to address that one? I think I can see Jason, are you speaking, but you're on maybe on mute or your microphone's not working? No, still can't hear you.
Jason, there's a button, there's an arrow on the mute button that selects your microphone. But otherwise, you can chat. You can use the chat function maybe to put your.
Okay. I thought number 7 was the level of empathy from retailer staff can affect customer assistance. People might have some more nuanced views once we publish the call recording study that we've done, but I'd be interested in anyone who's got any thoughts on that particular one.
I'm happy to make a comment on that one too. Sorry, I'm trying to get my camera to come across. Sorry, so if I'm looking side on, my apologies. I've got 2 screens. Okay, I think I got it. I think it is. Yeah. Sorry.
We're a tolerant group. You're amongst friends. So if you look the wrong direction, that's fine.
Sorry, you probably don't want my side profile, that's for sure. Not with this thing. It is more nuanced because the reason I say it isn't. You've obviously got the call recordings, you listen to them. The thing I'd say from an Agil's perspective, and I can't talk for other retailers, is that we take compliance with the framework really seriously. So that it's quite a long script for our consultants to work through when they're providing PDF assistance. It can take anything between 15 and 20 minutes to have that conversation. And unfortunately, because of the regulatory oversight and the level of detail in the regulation, consultants are trained to stick to a script. So if a customer wants to go down a different pathway or take a different approach, if we don't get certain questions out, we know that that will potentially get us a regulatory cross in terms of not meeting the obligations of the framework. And so the consultant will try and bring that conversation back to the questions we need to ask to meet the regulatory obligations. And that makes it for a really difficult conversation that it may come across to a customer that there's a lack of empathy, but then the poor consultant's stuck between a rock and a hard place, because they know that if they don't do and ask questions they need to, when they do their quality assurance training, they'll get a mark against their performance because they haven't met those regulatory obligations. So that's a really difficult conversation for consultants and customers to have, because it does sometimes come unempathetic, but both of them are trying to achieve an outcome that potentially might be different. Our consultants are trying to achieve a regulatory outcome as well as support the customer, and the customer may want to go down a different pathway. So I just think that we need to be careful when we talk about empathy to also consider how much regulation and how much scripting is created by the regulation, as opposed to giving the consultant the freedom to be a bit more empathetic and to take the conversation in the direction the customer may want to go.
That's an interesting challenge. I think the call recording study we're doing, which will potentially show, I mean, I'm sure it'll show variation across individuals that call centre staff, but also whether there's variations in the way the scripts are framed. But Carl, you wanted to speak to that?
Yeah, I agree with Con. It's really frustrating when we're doing a supported call and we have an authority to act, and someone who potentially doesn't speak English as a first language sitting with us, and there's a large amount of scripting that's quite disengaging for that household. Largely, they don't understand a lot of it. So I take that point, but One of the most common issues we're seeing at the moment is retailers hanging up on us when we're making a call. We hit the first bump in the road, and a common response is to be hung up on. So I do think empathy is definitely an issue that needs looking at.
Yeah. I'm personally a little bit surprised where that one got in the ranking, but I mean, I think it's a hard one, as both you and Connor pointed out. But that's something we'll look at. Emma, I think you've got a response there in the chat. Is that right, Emma?
Oh, it was just in relation to an earlier question from Sarah about legacy rates, and it's probably an issue for the VDO review actually, but just something to bear in mind about these legacy rates that are still circling around out there.
So these are people who are paying more than the VDO.
Mm.
Okay, and they're on standing offers.
Well, no, well, it depends. If it's electricity, then they couldn't be on a standing offer if it's more than the VDO. But that'd be really useful, Emma. If you do have any speaking to any consumers who would be willing to provide us with their bills, that would be really fantastic, because we do hear this occasionally, but haven't actually been able to see those bills. So
yeah, I can check with our practitioners.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's an issue at the margins, but even if it is, it creates a lot of pressure.
Absolutely. Thanks, and good to see you, Emma. I'll have to call you later.
Well, we're very keen. Yeah, I mean, one of the strong messages we got at the start of this project was we need to be basing it on empirical evidence as far as possible. And we've had lots of questions about the data today, because we'd got lots of anecdotes through the getting to fair process that people said, well, how frequent is that? So if we can get that specific evidence, that's fantastic. Kiara, you've got is your hand still up, or did you want to add anything?
No, I was going to jump in, and I don't want to hog the chatting, but I did, from memory, it was only 5 minutes ago, but I did vote, I think, for the empathy one. Yeah. And I think both Con and Carl's points are very accurate. When we were designing our One Stop One Story Hub, we did a whole lot of focus groups with humans. And when we were going through the consent scripts, they were like, this is garbage, and who actually listens to this? And so there's a lot to be said for how we can kind of co-design scripts with the actual humans that we're reading those scripts to. So I'm not sure if we've done a lot of work in that space, but I think that would be, I think, a really great thing to look into, to see and really test, are those scripts actually kind of disengaging and causing more harm than they are actually explaining the rights to the human. But the other thing is, and I think Carl mentioned it, I definitely saw it in Sandy's comments, there is that and I also understand that we've been through a pretty crazy couple of years, and I know that a lot of organisations across the spectrum have had to do a mass amount of recruitment in their call centres, and so that creates some, I guess, some gaps and some inconsistencies in that space. But I think that empathy, and I think Carl talked to training earlier in other areas, but I think, really understanding when humans are being inducted into these roles, are they getting that awareness training of, and really kind of understanding the human experience and that experience of vulnerability, so that when they are speaking to those humans, that they're engaging in a way that is enabling that human to tell their story and be really honest in their circumstance. And are they feeling that they're being judged, or are they feeling that they can trust that consultant that they call? So I think there's a bit of both. I definitely think scripting is a massive issue across the country, across every organisation, and how do we create more human scripts? But then, aside from that is also that continual learning and engagement in understanding the empathy for humans in frontline staff training.
Yeah, you raise a really interesting point. I mean, it's absolutely critical that we get the right information to consumers and they're well informed, but how do we do that in a way that's empathetic and not disengaging? So that's clearly something that we'll need to go forward on, I think. Jason, did you get your mic working, or are we still? No.
Sorry, Jason's just put in a message in the chat as well.
Okay, that's good. Excellent. Okay, so Jason, support care and comms, many are interlinked. Okay, so I think people can all see the chat there. So thank you for that. That's very helpful. I think what we were thinking of at this stage, in terms of the discussion of the ones that were sort of didn't make the top 5, we've talked about level of empathy, talked about energy costs. We haven't talked about opportunities to improve improvements in monitoring and framework. But I'd like to just ask if there's anyone who wants to talk to the issue about the appropriateness of and timing of retailer communications with customers varies. Is there anyone who, so 23% of you put that in the top 5. Is there anyone who wants to sort of advocate for that being why it should be in the top 5? Is there anybody we haven't heard from who might want to add to that?
I mean, I'm happy to talk to that point. I didn't put that in my top 5, and I think that many people didn't, probably because the appropriateness and timing of communications is quite heavily regulated. So in terms of when a customer receives communications from their retailer, like that is set out how we do that. And then the content or appropriateness of it is sort of a different question. I would suggest that if the response rate is so low, it probably indicates most people think that the timing and retailer communication content is appropriate. And so I'm not sure why we would then prosecute whether it should be raised up when the response is less than a quarter of the attendees there.
Okay, so I'm just checking to validate, you know, a number of people did obviously put in the top 5, but I share your view, Courtney. I think that's very helpful.
Simon, it's Jared speaking. Just to clarify, though, I think this was discussed a little bit earlier when Sandy was talking about consistency. So I don't think it may not be in the top 5 because people are distinguishing between things that ESC can do in scope in the next little while working together and things that are useful findings for other purposes or better understanding. So I think that the concern about better early identification and engagement with customers is a priority issue, but may not have come through in the survey in this context at this time as people were reading and interpreting the questions.
I wonder, Jared, if just looking at the polls, because items 1 and 2 talk about customers who cannot pay for ongoing usage and those with higher arrears, and I suspect people are sort of maybe saying this early intervention could help those 2 areas. And so there's just a big topic about early intervention in whatever way we can do that is probably what I'm hearing.
I'm just trying to draw that nuance between what are the heavily regulated comms and what are the opportunities for innovation by retailers with good data on where there's risk of debt accruing or earlier participation.
Yeah, we have observed looking at the data that if you're even grouping like the large retailers, there's quite substantial differences in the arrears when people go on to payment plans. And that's suggesting that those consumers who are customers of those retailers, for whatever reason, are engaging earlier before they've built up large arrears. And it may be the appropriateness and timing. I mean, Aaron mentioned earlier the point about the frequency of payment cycles. It seems that some retailers have a lot of people on quarterly payments, and that may be part of the maybe a problem that, you know, when you get a bill for the last quarter, particularly if it's in the winter period, that may be, you know, so if you'd had fortnightly payments, maybe that'd be different. But that's more about payment cycles and communications. But yeah, look, we'll just have to dig into that a bit more. It doesn't seem like that's going to be in our top 5 of things to get working on or get cracking on, or top 3 in the short term. Look, I think that's been really helpful. Aaron, I don't know whether you think it's worth going through that cycle of polling again, or would just rely on that data, but I think that's been really helpful discussion to sort of get some understanding of the challenges. With all of these, I don't think in the next phase when we're going to try and address them, I don't think any of them are things that we're going to be able to do just with retailers or just with the community group. So what we're hoping is that we'll be able to work in sort of smaller sort of working groups on some of these issues as we go forward. so that's the plan in the next phase. I just see that we've had another comment from Jason. It'd be great to get some examples of best practice around messaging and communications, scripting and conversations in the call analysis. That's a really interesting question. I think that's something we'll take on notice. It's a great idea because the external consultants who are listening to all these call recordings and rating them in terms of the degree of empathy, we can have a look and see what are the characteristics of those which are categorized as more empathetic. It may be, I mean, hopefully they're all compliant, but maybe it's about the language that people use. And we've all had more or less empathetic people on call centre calls. Recently, my 6 hours talking to Qantas, I found a limited amount of empathy there, but some organisations seem to have get more sort of empathy than others, or some individuals. So that's a great suggestion, Jason, that we can have a look and see what lessons there are on better practice, and also try and understand if there are patterns in particular retailers that are getting more of the consumers' calls are being rated as empathetic. What is it about? Is it about their training? Is it about their staff selection? I think that's important. So I think at this stage, rather than just on the basis that rather on the repolling, I think we might sort of try and bring this to an end, unless there's any particular questions. We've got a few questions before the session, and I think we've answered most of those, Aaron. One question I think we had was, how do you contact the Commission if you've got complaints about specific issues? And Emma gave us one example of problems that we should look into in more detail. I think the plan was that we were going to put the contact details into the chat. I don't know, Alex, if you've been able to do that. That's
just been put in. So just in the chat for everyone to see. That's an email you can use to put something.
I think you addressed a number of the other questions. One question I think we had was about the extent to which we're working with the Australian Energy Regulator. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been involved in their consultation processes, and our teams have been discussing it. And clearly, we've got a different framework than that applies across the rest of the country. But there are lessons that we're trying to learn from what they're seeing. What they're seeing relative to what we're seeing. I think the main sort of points, sort of summary today, which I found extremely useful and really appreciate so many of you taking the time to participate, is more people are receiving assistance and more appropriate assistance. And we are supporting people who can pay for their ongoing usage, but the challenge of supporting people who cannot pay for their ongoing usage is still a big challenge. That we'll need to work to look at more closely in the next phase, and also with our partners in government, in other agencies, departments that have responsibility for the policy issues here. The variation across retailers in terms of arrears of customers when they commence assessments. Some customers are getting help early and some are not. And we need to unpack this with the individual retailers to make sure that we understand what those differences are and what might be driving them. The challenge for retailers in ensuring engagement from customers is still a big issue. Partly that can be a function of the experience that they have with retailers, but partly it can be a whole lot of other things that are going on in people's lives, and how can we make, working particularly with the community sector, how can we make it easier for the community sector to support those customers who might be reluctant to reach out. Other priorities, assistance offered by the framework, as I said, might be able to best support people who cannot pay for their ongoing usage. Many customers have higher arrears despite standard assistance, aiming to avoid them getting into arrears, and we need to understand why that's not working as well as we'd like. I think we've heard, the URG, the utility, I'm trying to avoid the acronyms, the utility relief grant system, still got some way to go, but at least from the data we've seen, there's been a real uptick, and I think that's great that the retailers have stepped up and have provided additional support to customers in completing those, making their way through that. Knowledge of entitlements, awareness and entitlements varies. I think as I've mentioned to others, a friend of mine works at Citizens Advice Bureau, and she helped someone go for the Energy Savers program, which got that person $250, and the person was in tears at the end of that. So, these programs can make a huge difference to people's lives if we can get them in the hands of the people who need them most. So obviously that's something that departments, us at retailers and the community sector can work more on. So I found that really useful. I know Aaron and Lisa have. Sarah, our Executive Director for Energy, is been on the webinar the whole time, and I hope, Sarah, you've found it. We've got some useful insights. I don't know, putting on the spot, did you want to add anything before we finish up?
No, I think it's just really valuable to have these conversations, and just reiterate thanks to everyone for giving up your time to do this. And we want to make this meaningful, what we're doing, and hearing directly from you is the way we can do that. So thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. And I've finished this 7 minutes early, so surely I get bonus points for that. So thank you all for your time. And this isn't, unfortunately, not going to be the last time we're going to tap your knowledge and experience to help us work through this, but it's such an important project, we believe, and we really appreciate your involvement. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.